Well, there you are. You have arrived. Welcome, dreamer, to Cozy Tales Collective, where time slows, whispers take shape, and every flower has a story to tell. The fountain hums its quiet melody just beyond the bend, and a cozy nook awaits beneath the willow's embrace, perfect for those who dream and wonder. But before we begin, subscribe to this channel and comment where you are listening from. But before we begin, let's settle into place. Take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. Let the day melt away as you sink into a place of comfort and stillness. Feel the weight of your body resting against your bed, fully supported, fully at ease. Close your eyes and soften your breath. With each inhale, invite peace. With each exhale, release any lingering tension. Let go of the thoughts of the day. They can wait until tomorrow. Right now, all that matters is this moment. Imagine a warm, gentle light surrounding you, like a soft blanket of calm. It soothes your mind, relaxes your muscles, and welcomes you into a space of quiet serenity. Your mind is open yet at peace, ready to drift into a world of imagination. Soon a story will begin, a gentle journey to guide you into deep, restful sleep. Take one more deep breath in and let it go. You are safe, you are relaxed, and you are ready to dream. Now let the story begin. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and pine as Keaton Evans stepped off the rusting Greyhound bus, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The town of Havens Cove had not changed much in the years he had been away. Weathered, clapboard houses, boats bobbing in the harbor, and the ever-present sound of seagulls crying above. It was a place that clung to the past, even as time pressed forward. Keaton's boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way up Main Street, his gaze flickering over the familiar storefronts. The bakery still had the same display of golden croissants in the window, and the general store still had a sign that leaned a little too far to the left. But it was the Estrada family's inn that drew his attention most. A sprawling, two-story whitewashed building with blue shutters, nestled near the cliffs where the land met the sea. He hesitated, gripping the strap of his bag tighter. "Well, well," a voice called from the inn's porch, drawing his attention. "If it isn't Keaton Evans, back from the dead." Keaton's lips twitched at the familiar lilt in the voice. Casey Estrada leaned against the railing, arms folded over her chest, her dark curls tousled by the ocean wind. She wore paint-splattered jeans and an oversized sweater, looking as if she had just come from one of her coastal landscapes. "Didn't think I'd see you here again," she said, her brown eyes sharp, though not unkind. "You planning on staying or just passing through?" "Depends on how long my mother needs me," Keaton answered, shifting under her gaze. "She's not well. I figured it was time to come home." Casey's expression softened. "I heard about your mom." "I'm sorry, Keaton. If you need anything, you know where to find me." He nodded, appreciating the offer more than he let on. Silence stretched between them, filled by the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. The last time they had spoken was years ago, before he left, before he made the choice to stay gone. "How's the inn?" he asked, more to fill the silence than anything. "Busy," Casey replied, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Tourists love a good ocean view. Not much has changed since you left, except me, of course. I've become incredibly famous." Keaton let out a low chuckle. "Oh yeah? The great Casey Estrada? That's right. My paintings sell for a fortune now. Well, a modest fortune. A small-town fortune. But hey, enough to keep the inn running and me covered in paint." His eyes drifted to her hands, smudged with blue and white, likely from her latest piece. She had always been that way, more color than person, a spirit impossible to confine. "You still painting the cliffs?" he asked. "Every day," she said, tilting her head slightly. "And you? You still out on the water?" His grip tightened on his bag. "Not for a while." Casey studied him for a moment, her gaze flickering with curiosity, but she didn't press. Instead, she jerked her chin toward the harbor. "Walk with me?" Keaton hesitated only briefly before nodding. They fell into step together, the way they had countless times as children, running along the shore with sand between their toes and salt in their hair. The years had carved space between them. But now, with the ocean beside them and the scent of home in the air, it felt almost as if no time had passed at all. "Remember when we used to hunt for sea glass?" Casey mused, nudging his arm. "You always found the best pieces." "I had a good eye," Keaton admitted. "You used to make those necklaces out of them." "Still do." Casey grinned, pulling at the chain around her neck, revealing a smooth piece of green glass. "Found this one the day after you left. Guess I was hoping you'd come back for it." Something in Keaton's chest tightened, but he masked it with a smirk. "Didn't know I was that sentimental." Casey rolled her eyes. "You weren't. That's why I kept it." They walked in easy silence, the wind tugging at their clothes. But there was something else beneath the quiet, a tension, a weight. Keaton knew it had to do with his leaving, with the things he hadn't said, and maybe with the things he was still keeping to himself. "So what aren't you telling me?" Casey asked suddenly, her voice gentle but knowing. "You're back for your mom, sure, but there's something else." Keaton's steps faltered. He should have known she would pick up on it. Casey had always been able to read him better than most. He could tell her, he thought. Maybe she would understand. But the truth was heavy, tangled in the past he wasn't ready to revisit. "It's just been a long time," he said instead, offering a small, tired smile. "I guess I'm still figuring out where I fit in all this." Casey didn't push. Instead, she nudged him with her shoulder. "Well, you fit here, whether you like it or not." Keaton let out a breath, his gaze drifting out over the water. Maybe she was right. Maybe, despite everything, Haven's Cove still had a place for him. And maybe, just maybe, Casey Estrada was still a part of it. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the town in golden light, Keaton felt something shift, something old and familiar, something that had been waiting for him all along. Home. Keaton had always imagined what it would be like to return to Windmere Cove, but nothing prepared him for the flood of emotions that surged through him every time he saw Casey. She had always been his tether to the past, a connection to memories he both cherished and feared. As they spent more time together, it felt like the years had never passed, their bond as effortless as it had been when they were teenagers. Late-night conversations on the porch of Casey's family home, where the sea breeze tangled her dark hair, brought back a sense of belonging he had long thought lost. Their walks along the shore, barefoot in the cool sand, held the comfort of something once familiar, yet they were tinged with an unspoken apprehension. Robert Estrada's gaze was sharp whenever Keaton was near. The older man's wariness had been evident from the first moment they'd spoken again, and his warning still echoed in Keaton's mind. "Some ghosts should stay buried," Robert had said, his voice low and edged with meaning. Keaton had nodded, offering a polite smile, but inside his chest tightened. Robert knew something, perhaps everything, and if he did, how much had he told Casey? The weight of his past loomed over him, gnawing at his conscience. He had returned to Windmere Cove under the pretense of reconnecting, of making amends, but the truth ran deeper, more treacherous. Casey saw only the man she had loved once, the boy who had promised forever. She didn't see the storm raging beneath his surface, the one that could destroy them both if she ever learned the truth. Then the letter arrived. Keaton had found it wedged beneath his front door when he returned from one of his evening walks with Casey. The envelope was yellowed, its edges slightly frayed. His name was written in bold, deliberate strokes across the front. No return address, no indication of its sender. His pulse quickened as he stepped inside, locking the door behind him before carefully tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. As his eyes scanned the words, his breath caught in his throat. "You don't belong here. Leave before the past finds you." Beneath the typed message was a smaller slip of paper, one that sent a chill down his spine. A photograph, old and grainy, depicting two figures standing on a dock. Even in black and white he recognized them immediately. One was his father, the other was Robert Estrada. Keaton's grip tightened around the letter. His father had never spoken of Robert, never mentioned any connection between their families. Yet here was undeniable proof that something had linked them long before Keaton and Casey had ever met. The truth he had been running from was beginning to catch up to him. The next day he met Casey by the lighthouse, the spot they had always gone to escape the world when they were younger. She smiled at him, eyes filled with warmth, and he wished he could hold on to that moment forever. "You okay?" she asked, her fingers grazing his. Keaton hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just thinking." About what? He debated telling her, about the letter, the photo, the warning. But how could he, when he didn't even understand it himself? "Just us," he said instead, watching as her smile grew. That night he couldn't sleep. The photograph lay on the nightstand, its edges curling slightly, as if whispering secrets he wasn't ready to hear. But he had no choice. The past was no longer content to stay buried, and soon Casey would have to know the truth. Casey held the journal close to her chest, her heart pounding in sync with the wild storm outside. The old leather binding felt fragile against her fingers, its edges worn from time. The ink had faded in places, but Margaret Estrada's words still stood strong on the yellowed pages. Casey could hardly believe she was holding a piece of her mother's past, a past she had never truly understood. Keaton stood frozen in the doorway, his blue eyes flickering with unease as he watched Casey flip through the pages. He swallowed hard, a pit forming in his stomach. This was the one thing he had never wanted her to find. "Casey, put that down," he said, his voice strained. "Please." Casey looked up, confusion clouding her features. "Why?" Keaton clenched his fists, hesitating. "That journal, it's dangerous." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It's my mother's journal, Keaton. How could it be dangerous?" He took a step forward, but she stepped back. The storm outside raged, lightning illuminating the attic for a split second. The journal's pages rustled in the draft, whispering secrets Casey wasn't sure she was ready to hear. "Tell me what you know," she demanded, "because something in here scares you." Keaton exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not just about your mother, Casey. It's about our families. My family." Casey's grip tightened on the journal. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for only a moment before he spoke. "Your mother and my grandfather, Matthew Calloway, they were involved in something that tore this town apart decades ago." The name sent a chill down Casey's spine. "I don't understand." Keaton glanced at the journal, his expression darkening. "She wrote about it, didn't she?" Casey hesitated, then slowly opened the journal to a random page, the dated entry catching her eye. June 17th, 1981. "I should have listened to my heart. Matthew warned me, but I didn't listen. Now everything is falling apart. The Callaways will never forgive me for what I've done." Her breath caught in her throat. What did she do? Keaton's jaw tensed. She tried to stop something before it went too far. He ran a hand through his hair, visibly frustrated. "My grandfather and your mother were close once, but when she uncovered a secret about his business dealings, everything changed. She threatened to expose him, and in return, she was cast out. Your family suffered because of it." Casey's fingers trembled as she turned the page, her mother's words unraveling before her. "I can't undo what I've set in motion. If anything happens to me, Casey must never know the truth. She must never trust a Calloway." Casey looked up, eyes locking onto Keaton's with a sharp, painful realization. "She was talking about you." Keaton took a step forward, desperation in his voice. "Casey, I'm not my grandfather. I love you." Tears blurred her vision. "But you knew, didn't you? You knew about this all along." He reached for her, but she pulled away. "I didn't know everything," he admitted. "I knew our families had a past, but I never wanted it to matter. I never wanted it to come between us." Lightning cracked outside, illuminating the attic once more. The journal felt heavier in Casey's hands. She had dreamed of leaving this town behind, starting fresh with Keaton. But how could she, knowing he had kept this from her? "I need time," she whispered, stepping past him. "Casey, please." She didn't turn back. Clutching the journal, she descended the attic stairs, each step feeling like she was walking further away from the life she had just begun to build. Below, the wind howled through the inn, rattling the old windows. Casey knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The first rumble of thunder shook the sky just as Casey stepped out of Mrs. Whitaker's house. The old woman's words still echoed in her mind, twisting like gnarled roots around every suspicion she'd buried over the last few weeks. "Some histories are better left untouched, dear. But the Evans and Estradas, their past is written in fire and regret." Casey had pressed for details, but Mrs. Whitaker's cloudy eyes had grown distant, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly as she turned away. That was the end of their conversation. Now, as she hurried down the narrow streets toward home, the wind picked up, tugging at her jacket, whispering through the trees with a warning she couldn't ignore. The Evans and Estrada families, her family and Keaton's, shared more than just tangled roots in the town's history. There was something buried there, something Keaton was afraid for her to find. By the time she reached the house, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. Keaton was already on the porch, pacing, his posture tense. He looked up sharply as she approached, his blue eyes stormy and unreadable. "You went to see her," he said, voice low. Casey frowned. "How did you—" "I just know." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Casey, you need to leave this alone." Her heart pounded against her ribs. "I can't. Not when I feel like everything we've ever known is built on a lie." Keaton closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though bracing himself for what came next. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but the weight of it was heavier than the storm rolling in around them. "It's not a lie," he murmured. "It's just not the truth you want it to be." Lightning split the sky behind him, illuminating the sharp angles of his face, the tension lining his jaw. Casey felt the pull of the moment, the way the storm outside seemed to mimic the one unraveling between them. She took a step forward, refusing to back down. "Tell me, Keaton." For a long time he said nothing. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the porch roof, soaking into the wooden steps where they stood. Then, finally, his shoulders sagged. "Our families," he began slowly. "They weren't always enemies. In fact, they were something else entirely." Casey's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Keaton hesitated, his fingers curling into fists. "My grandfather and yours. They built this town together. But their partnership turned bitter. Over land, over power, and over a woman." The words sent a chill through Casey's veins. She thought back to the hushed whispers she had heard as a child, the odd looks the elders had exchanged when the topic of their families came up. But no one had ever spoken of a woman. "What woman?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keaton looked away, rain streaking down his face. "Your grandmother." Casey felt the world tilt beneath her feet. That's not possible. It is, Keaton said, his voice raw. She was engaged to my grandfather first. The storm cracked above them, loud enough to shake the windows. Casey staggered back, shaking her head. No, that doesn't make sense. My grandfather loved her. They had a marriage built on stolen love. Keaton's voice was thick with something she couldn't name. She left my grandfather for yours. It destroyed him. And it destroyed any chance of peace between our families. Casey's pulse roared in her ears. It was too much. Too big. This wasn't just some old family rivalry. This was betrayal woven into the very foundation of their bloodlines. Why didn't anyone tell us? She asked, barely able to find her voice. Keaton laughed, but it was hollow. Because they knew it would only lead to more pain. Casey hugged herself against the cold. And what about us? Keaton didn't answer right away. The wind howled between them. That's what I've been trying to figure out, he admitted finally. If we're doomed to repeat their mistakes, or if we can be different. The storm raged on, but Casey barely felt it now. Her mind was caught in a whirlwind of memories, questions, and a sinking realization that nothing would ever be the same again. She looked at Keaton, the boy she had loved since childhood, the man she had fought to hold on to despite the odds. But now, those odds felt impossibly high. "Do you regret us?" she asked softly. Keaton reached for her hand, fingers trembling. Never. The answer should have reassured her, but as the storm crashed around them, Casey couldn't help but wonder if love alone would be enough to survive the weight of the past. Casey stood frozen in the dimly lit living room, Keaton's confession reverberating in her skull like a cruel echo. The warmth of the moment before, the anger, the desperation, the heartbreak, had all collapsed into something cold and unrecognizable. Her fingers twitched at her sides. "You're lying," she whispered, though even as she spoke she knew the truth was written all over Keaton's face. Keaton ran a hand through his hair, his movements tense and restless. "I wish I was," he admitted, voice hoarse. "I wish I didn't have to tell you, Casey. But I couldn't." "Couldn't what? Keep your mouth shut?" Her voice was rising, shaking, filled with something dangerously close to hysteria. "You had no problem keeping it a secret when you... The words cut off, too painful to say aloud. Keaton's jaw clenched. "You think I wanted this?" His voice was sharp, bitter. "You think I wasn't dying inside every time I looked at you, knowing what I knew?" Casey took a step back. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't look at anything. The room blurred at the edges, the weight of the revelation crushing her from all sides. "Get out," she whispered. "Casey." "I said get out." Keaton hesitated, his entire body rigid, as if he wanted to say something else. But there was nothing to say. Finally, he turned and walked out the door, closing it behind him with a quiet, deliberate click. Casey collapsed onto the couch, gasping for breath. How had everything unraveled so fast? Just days ago she had thought she'd found something real with Keaton. Something no one, not her overbearing father, not the judgmental town, could take from her. Now all of it was poisoned. She pressed her hands to her face, feeling the heat of her own tears. It wasn't just betrayal. It was devastation. By the next morning, the whispers had already started. Casey knew the second she stepped into the local cafe. The place went eerily silent, the sound of ceramic mugs clinking against plates suddenly deafening. Mrs. Loring, who'd always smiled at her, pressed her lips into a tight line and looked away. Two women by the counter exchanged glances, muttering behind their hands. Casey's stomach twisted. She gritted her teeth, walking past them as if she couldn't hear, as if she didn't feel the weight of their judgment. She barely made it to the counter before Olivia, her childhood friend and now the cafe's owner, set down a steaming mug and shook her head. "You should go home, Case." Casey stiffened. "Excuse me?" Olivia's expression was unreadable, but her fingers tapped against the countertop. "People are talking." "Let them talk." Olivia exhaled. "You know how this town works. And Keaton..." She hesitated. "He's not here." Casey's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "He left." Casey's breath caught. "Where?" "No one knows. His mom's been keeping quiet." Olivia studied her, lowering her voice. "People are saying he ran because we're related," Casey bit out. Olivia flinched but didn't deny it. Casey swallowed, her throat raw. She didn't know if the nausea rising in her chest was from hearing it spoken aloud, or from the fact that it was exactly what she had feared. She turned on her heel and walked out. Casey had never stepped foot in Helen Evans's house before, but now she stood at the door, heart pounding against her ribs. The door opened before she could knock. Helen was older than Casey had realized, her face lined with exhaustion. The sight of her sent an unexpected surge of anger through Casey's veins. Helen took one look at her and sighed. "I was expecting this." "Where is he?" Casey demanded. Helen hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." Casey clenched her jaw but walked inside. The living room was neat, but there was something tense in the air. Helen sat on the couch, folding her hands in her lap. "Keaton left town last night." Casey's heart twisted. "Where?" "I don't know." Casey's fists clenched. "You have to know. He wouldn't just..." She stopped herself, breath shuddering. "He wouldn't just disappear." Helen's gaze softened, but there was something weary in it. "He loves you, Casey. That's why he left." The words struck like a knife. Helen sighed, rubbing a hand over her temple. "I always knew this day would come." Casey's skin prickled. "What are you talking about?" Helen exhaled slowly. "I knew there was a chance you two would meet. A chance you'd be drawn to each other. It's ironic, isn't it? Fate has a cruel sense of humor." Casey's throat tightened. "Why didn't you stop it?" Helen looked down. "Because I was selfish." She shook her head. "I never wanted to hurt you, or Keaton, but the past has a way of creeping up on you, no matter how much you try to bury it." Casey swallowed hard. "Did my dad know?" Helen's jaw tightened. "Robert knew about Keaton, but he never acknowledged him. He never wanted to." Something cold settled in Casey's chest. Her father had always been a man of control, a man who dictated every aspect of her life. And he had known. The weight of it all was suffocating. Casey stood abruptly. "I need to go." Helen didn't stop her. Casey stormed into her father's office, slamming the door behind her. Robert Estrada barely glanced up from his desk. "I assume you've come to yell at me?" Casey's chest heaved. "You knew?" Robert sighed, setting his pen down. "Yes." Casey's hands shook. "How could you? How could you let this happen?" Robert steepled his fingers. "I did what was necessary." Her breath came in sharp gasps. "Necessary? You let me fall in love with my own—" The words choked in her throat. Her father's face darkened. "You think I had control over that? You think I wanted this?" Casey swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You could have told me?" Robert's jaw clenched. "And what? Destroy everything?" He exhaled sharply. "I built this family. I built this town. You don't understand the sacrifices I've made to keep our reputation intact." Casey let out a hollow laugh. "Reputation?" She shook her head. "That's all you care about, isn't it?" Robert leaned forward. "Listen to me, Casey. This is not the end of the world. You will move on, and so will he." Casey stared at him, something breaking inside her. He would never understand. She turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her. Days passed, then weeks. Keaton didn't return. The town continued to whisper, but Casey didn't care anymore. She had lost him, and maybe she had lost a part of herself too. But as she stood on the outskirts of town one evening, staring at the road that led beyond, she realized something. This wasn't just about heartbreak. It was about freedom. And maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to finally escape, to leave behind the town that had bound her, to find something more. The road stretched ahead, endless and uncertain, and for the first time in her life, Casey wasn't afraid. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Casey sat on the cold hardwood floor of her apartment, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the untouched cup of tea on the coffee table. It had long since gone cold, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The weight of Keaton's betrayal pressed heavily on her chest, suffocating her, making every breath feel like a struggle. Her mind replayed the moments leading up to the collapse of everything she had once held sacred. The warmth of Keaton's touch, the whispered promises, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. It had all been a lie, or at least it felt that way. Her phone buzzed on the table. She didn't need to check the screen to know it was Robert Estrada. He had called 5 times in the last 2 hours, his messages becoming more urgent with each one. "There's something I need to tell you. Please, Casey, call me back." But she couldn't. Not yet. Keaton gripped the worn strap of his duffel bag as he stepped onto the platform. The evening train wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes, leaving him alone with nothing but his thoughts. He had ruined everything. The betrayal in Casey's eyes haunted him, a relentless echo of his own self-loathing. He had never meant for things to unfold this way, but intentions didn't change the damage done. He was poison in her life, and the only thing left to do was disappear. But Robert's words nagged at him. "Are you so sure you know who you really are, Keaton?" Keaton had scoffed at the time, dismissing it as yet another attempt at manipulation. But something about Robert's expression, equal parts regret and desperation, unsettled him. And now, on the edge of leaving everything behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a piece of his past he had yet to uncover. Casey finally answered the phone just as Robert was about to leave another message. "Casey," he breathed, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God, What do you want?" she cut in, her voice hollow. "I know you don't want to hear from me right now, but I swear it's important." Silence stretched between them. Then, quieter, he said, "I don't think Keaton is who we think he is." Her breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" Robert exhaled. His paternity. It was never actually confirmed. The DNA test results were inconclusive all those years ago, but I lied. I told Keaton he was a match to his father because I thought it was the best thing for him. Casey felt like the ground had just shifted beneath her. "You thought?" she whispered, her grip tightening around the phone. "You lied to him about something like that?" "I didn't want him to grow up questioning where he belonged," Robert admitted. "But the truth is, there's a chance he's not his father's son." Casey squeezed her eyes shut. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Keaton deserves to know," Robert said. "And because I've arranged another test. This time there won't be any lies." Casey's stomach twisted. She wasn't sure if this revelation made anything better or worse. But she did know one thing. Keaton had to hear the truth before he left. Casey drove through the rain-slicked streets, her fingers clenched around the steering wheel. She had barely hung up before grabbing her keys, her pulse racing as she navigated toward the train station. She didn't know what she would say to him. She didn't even know if he would listen. But she had to try. As she pulled into the lot, she spotted him immediately, standing under the dim yellow glow of the platform lights, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his decision. "Keaton!" she shouted, running toward him. He turned, surprise flashing across his face as she skidded to a stop in front of him. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice weary. "You can't leave," she said breathlessly. "Not yet." He let out a bitter laugh. "Why not? There's nothing left for me here." "There might be," she said, softer this time. Keaton frowned. "What are you talking about?" She swallowed. "Robert lied to you. About your father. There's a chance the man you thought was your father wasn't." His entire body went rigid. "What?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "There's another DNA test, the real one this time." Keaton shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Why should I believe anything he says?" "Because this is your chance to know the truth." She hesitated. "To know who you really are." For a long moment, Keaton just stared at her, as if searching for an answer in her face. The train's horn blared in the distance. He looked toward the approaching lights, then back at Casey. And then, slowly, he let his duffel bag slip from his shoulder, hitting the ground with a dull thud. "Let's do the test," he said. Days later, they sat in a sterile clinic room, waiting. Keaton's leg bounced anxiously as he clenched his fists. Casey sat beside him, quiet, offering silent support. Robert stood across from them, his guilt palpable. Finally, the doctor entered, holding an envelope. Keaton's breath hitched. The doctor cleared his throat. "The results are in." The room seemed to shrink around them. "Keaton," the doctor said gently, "the man you were told was your father was not a genetic match." The words struck him like a physical blow. He wasn't the man's son. He wasn't who he thought he was. His hands trembled as he took the papers, scanning them even though the numbers blurred together. Casey placed a hand on his arm. "Keaton?" He barely heard her. His mind was reeling, spiraling. If that man wasn't his father, then who was? And why had Robert kept this from him for so long? Keaton turned toward Robert, his expression unreadable. "Start talking," he said, his voice deadly calm. And Robert, looking more haunted than ever, nodded. "All right," he whispered. "It's time you know everything." Casey sat on the weathered porch swing of her childhood home, the creak of the chains rhythmic against the heavy silence between her and Keaton. The summer air was thick with salt, the tide beyond the dunes rolling in and out as if whispering secrets only the sea could keep. The DNA test had shattered the lie that bound them, but it hadn't erased the scars. Keaton leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground as if the answers he needed were buried there. "So, what now?" His voice was low, uncertain. Casey hesitated, gripping the wooden armrest of the swing as she searched for the right words. "I don't know," she admitted. "This changes everything and nothing at the same time." He turned to her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. Regret, relief, or maybe both. "We lost years, Case. Years of thinking something that was never true," she finished for him. "I know, but that doesn't mean we can just go back." Keaton flinched. "You don't think we can move forward?" She let out a slow breath, watching the way the wind played with the loose strands of his hair. "I don't know how to," she confessed. "Not when every memory of us is tangled with pain." Keaton clenched his jaw, staring out toward the ocean. "You don't want to try?" "I didn't say that." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "But don't you feel like we're standing on broken glass? Like every step forward risks reopening a wound?" He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he exhaled sharply. "I guess I just thought, once we knew the truth, everything would fall back into place." Casey swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Nothing ever falls back into place, Keaton. We can't unlive what we've been through." A gust of wind rustled through the trees, sending leaves skittering across the porch. The weight of the conversation pressed down on them, suffocating. Then Keaton shifted, resting his hand lightly on top of hers. "I don't want to lose you again." Her fingers twitched under his touch, the familiarity of it sending an ache through her chest. "I don't want to lose you either," she admitted. "But I don't know how to make this right." Keaton tightened his grip. "Then let's figure it out together." Casey wanted to believe it was that simple, that love, true, unburdened love, could emerge from the wreckage. But doubt still gnawed at her, whispering that even the strongest foundations cracked under too much pressure. Still, as she looked into Keaton's eyes, something in her shifted. Maybe they couldn't go back, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something new. And for the first time in years, hope flickered to life. The weeks following Keaton's decision to stay weren't easy. Trust was not a switch to be flipped, but a bridge painstakingly rebuilt, plank by plank. Casey wasn't sure if they would ever return to what they once were, but maybe that was never the point. Maybe love wasn't about going back. Maybe it was about choosing to move forward, scars and all. The town, once relentless in its whispers, had grown tired of the drama. The stares dwindled, the rumors softened, and life in their small coastal town settled back into its usual rhythm. But Casey and Keaton knew better. Things had changed forever. The wounds between them, though healing, left behind remnants of pain. Keaton threw himself into work, taking on extra shifts at the docks, helping his father repair the boats. It was his way of proving something, not just to Casey, but to himself, that he could stay, that he wouldn't run when things got difficult, that he could be someone worth trusting again. Casey, meanwhile, struggled with the tug-of-war in her heart. She loved Keaton, she always had, but love alone had never been the problem. It was the broken trust, the quiet ache that sometimes crept up on her when she least expected it. Nights were the hardest when memories whispered doubts into her mind. Still, every morning she chose to meet him halfway. Their conversations were careful at first, tentative. They spoke of little things, the weather, work, the latest town gossip. But slowly, as the weeks passed, the walls between them lowered. They talked about the past, about the hurt, about the mistakes that led them here. It wasn't perfect. Some nights ended in silence, in unresolved tension, but others ended in quiet laughter, in moments that felt like the beginning of something new. One evening, Keaton showed up at her front door with an old notebook in his hands. "I found this," he said, holding it out. Casey took it hesitantly, flipping open the pages. Her breath caught. It was hers. A journal she had kept when they were younger, filled with sketches, little notes about their dreams. "You used to write about running away to the city," Keaton said softly. "Starting fresh somewhere new. I always thought maybe I was holding you back." Casey shook her head. "You never held me back, Keaton." He hesitated. "And now?" She looked at him, searching his face, the boy she once knew and the man he was becoming. "I don't know, but I think I'd rather figure it out with you than without you." That was all it took. A small promise, fragile but real. A month later, they found themselves by the ocean, standing where it all began. The sun hung low on the horizon, bleeding streaks of pink and orange across the sky. The waves whispered against the shore, a quiet rhythm that matched the beat of their hearts. Keaton reached for her hand. Casey hesitated for only a second before lacing her fingers through his. His grip was warm, steady. "There are no guarantees," she murmured. "I know," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere." She turned to him, really looking at him. "And if I can't promise that I'll never doubt again, then I'll remind you every day that I'm here," he said simply. "That's all I can do." She let out a soft breath, leaning her head against his shoulder as the wind wrapped around them. They weren't perfect, they were still healing, but in that moment, with the ocean stretching before them and the weight of the past no longer pressing so heavily between them, Casey realized something. Maybe love wasn't about never breaking. Maybe it was about choosing, despite the cracks, to stay together,